In a recent online poll, American workers were asked the following question: would you be willing to take a 10% pay cut if you were able to work from home rather than going back to the office? Now, I'm pretty sure the results of this poll were less than scientific, but according to the poll, let's take a bet here. Who thinks it was 10%? Raise your hand. 20%? 30? 40? 50? 60? Okay, I'll stop there because the answer was 44% of workers said that they would work from home and take a 10% pay cut. Only I would bet that if you had asked this question before the pandemic, that this number would not have been anywhere near as high. Instead, there would have been plenty of talk about the need for office culture, productivity, and separation between work life and home life. Don't agree with me? Well, 2 decades ago, Rabbi Jacob Herber gave a sermon at Har Zion Temple in Philadelphia on the High Holy Days. And he charged his somewhat affluent congregation to do this. He asked them, would you be willing to take 10% less money to spend 10% more time at home with your families? Who thinks that sermon went over well? Who thinks it was an absolute disaster? It was an absolute disaster. Rabbi, they said, you don't get us. You're being insensitive. We need that 10%. Why would we make that change? Needless to say, it's been years, and in those years, society has also evolved and changed. I know this because I've given this exact same sermon at least 2 times since I've been here. Not one of you has ever blinked an eye, unless, of course, it was because you were catching up on some sleep. And I would bet that now, after the pandemic, you would expect me to give this sermon. Because quite possibly 44% of you in the workforce right now are considering taking 10% less money if you would be able to work from home at this very moment. In this week's Torah portion, we read one of the 10 most short verses in the entire Torah. It's only 3 words, but they are 3 words that pack a punch and resonate with us today. Those words are, Vayehi acharei hamagefa, and it came to pass after the plague. In this week's Torah portion, God sends a plague to punish the Israelites. It's terrible, it's awful. Only what we also see in this particular moment after the plague, acharei hamagefa, is a moment of disruption in that society that creates an opportunity for the Israelites in their time to change too. In chapter 26, we read about the plague. What did we read at the very beginning of chapter 27? The story of the brave and courageous Benot Slavchad, a story about women who, following the plague, decided to change the law, to change the norm, so they could inherit their father's property. The Torah tells us, Vayechi acharei hamagefa, it came to pass that the plague was over. And it's right in that moment that these courageous women see an opportunity to challenge the social convention. They recognize the reality on the ground is different. The time is ripe for change. And so they go to Moses and say, Moses, Vayehi acharei hamagefa, our father died in the plague, but not because of the plague, just in that time. It's time to change the law so women can inherit too. Moses isn't so sure. He goes to God. God says, Moses, Benot Slavchad dobrot. They are correct. The time has changed. It's time after the plague to make things different. In the New York Times this week, David Brooks wrote a very powerful column in which he makes the case that we in this country are about to enter a time of great renaissance for America. Folks, this is a moment of great hope and optimism. Let's not miss it. Because he argues whenever human beings have lived through disruption, quote, old patterns that stifle human creativity are swiped away. Disruption, he writes, historically speaking, has always made time for new ideas and for creative innovation to take root. Has anyone here ever seen any of Ken Follett's or read his books or any of those movies, The Pillars of the Earth? If you've ever read those books about Kingsbridge, you know that he loves to play on this idea of disruption. In any of Ken Follett's books, the main characters are always at each other's throats over some social convention or religious tradition. And then what happens? An invading army comes and kills everybody. Or the Black Death comes. Nearly the entire population is wiped out and none of it matters anymore. Vayehi acharei hamagifa, the society begins to rebuild and the world changes after the plague. Today's Hebrew date is the 23rd of Tammuz, 5781. It is the day after our plague. What has happened to us? What's going to change in our world today? In many ways, as Jews, I think we should take great comfort from the stability and the resiliency that Judaism exhibited during our time in plague. Throughout the pandemic, we held virtual services. We were able to connect and chat with our friends over Shabbat and over the weeks. We held more online classes than ever. I did counseling online with people suffering from the effects of the plague. Honestly, except from the bagels, we didn't change all that much. But you'll get no argument from me on this one point. Wasn't it also refreshing, and isn't it also refreshing how in this moment, the disruption that we experienced in the world allowed us to see it differently? Wasn't it wonderful how the pandemic freed us up to be Benot Tzlov Chad, to follow their example, to challenge conventions, and to experience new things? You know, when we put our services on live stream, and that's now going to be a permanent fixture of our community, no one wagged a finger at me and said, "Rabbi, you must jump through every Jewish legal hoop possible to justify its use." Did I personally agonize with it? You bet I did. But the disruption to our everyday routine has taught us to see what we could not see before. There are people who feel excluded from our community who we weren't reaching. Some of you may have caught a piece in Tablet magazine. It was published by an author called Elaine Graydon. The title is way too long, but since the title's too long, you don't need to read the rest of the article. Here's what it's called, quote, "Getting the Hang of Shul. How I used to feel alienated in synagogue, unsure of what I was supposed to do. How attending services over Zoom during the pandemic helped me to become more comfortable. And now I'm finally ready to go in person without feeling awkward." That's a victory, isn't it? We held Tat Shabbat, not in our building, but in our parking lot. Parking lot Tat Shabbat. Dozens of young families would show up every week to connect. It was a little bit like a big tailgate party. They parked their cars, they put out lawn chairs. To think they came in droves and we didn't even feed them. Heaven forbid they didn't come dressed for shul. Did God send a plague? I mean, God did send a plague, but not because of the way they were dressed. We built a different kind of community over parking lot Tat Shabbat. And I know it's one that Rabbi Miller and I are eager to capitalize on to figure out how we're going to bring them in. I hear a lot of them in the corner this morning. not necessarily on my terms, but on theirs. Vayehi acharei hamagefa. How in this moment will we honor the memories of the many who have died? This week's parsha no doubt reminds us that to honor their memories, we must make the most of the moment, carpe diem, by seizing it. We must be benot slav chad. We must grow and change our new reality in the new reality in which we find ourselves right now. Linda Pollack, our wonderful president, has gotten accustomed to reminding me whenever we're in our office those famous words of Tevye from the end of Fiddler on the Roof. It's a new world, Golda. To her and to all of you, I say yes. Yes, it is a new world. Only let us remember also what Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, the first chief rabbi of Israel, reminded us as well famously. He said, don't leave the past behind. Take it with you. Take the old and make it new, and take the new and make it holy, make it sacred. That's what Jews have continued to do in times of pandemic. It's what we're going to do in the times in which we find ourselves right now. Vayehi acharei hamagefa. The plague has abated. So now this Shabbat, let us pick up the task. Let's take that old and make it new. Let's take that new together and make it holy. Shabbat Shalom. At this time, we'll now continue with a prayer for our country on page 177, as well as a prayer for our state of Israel. And of course, on this 4th of July weekend, I want to wish all of you a beautiful and meaningful celebration with your families as we remember as Jews how privileged and blessed we are to live in such a wonderful country that allows us to practice our Judaism in its fullness in our day.